Hello, hello, and greetings, everybody. My name is Igor Skibickij, and I'm the Chief Operations Officer at Bonard. I brought some reinforcements for this session, so today I will be partnering with Julia Momotiuk, who is our Director of Rented Residential Research. Julia, can you hear us? How are you today?
All is good, Igor. Yes. Hi, everyone. Hi, Igor. Happy to be here.
Excellent. We also have our technical support in the background, making sure that everything is running smoothly. So in case you have any difficulties, feel free to post in chat. Feel free to introduce yourself in the chat. Where are you coming from? But we roughly know. This session will be recorded. The recording will be made available at the end of the session. You can also request the slides, the presentation itself, in case you would like to share it, distribute with your colleagues, friends, family. Everybody will be on mute just to ensure a smooth experience for all the participants, except for me and Julia. And therefore, if you would like to ask any questions, feel free to ask anytime during the session, but we may limit to answering the session at the end, just not to break up the flow of the session. So preferably try to post your questions in the Q&A section. Sometimes people post in chat, that's fine, we can check that too, but it makes us go back and forth. So to avoid that, let's try to stick with the questions to the Q&A, and we will try to tackle the questions at the end. So for this session, I will cover roughly half of it, starting with the student mobility trends. As the name suggests, our session today is about Chinese students and their preferences and behaviors towards student housing. So we have some student mobility data and macro trends to set the context. We have the findings of the very first survey of Chinese students, which was exclusively focused on student accommodation. So it's a bit of experimental theme for us today. We hope you will enjoy it. As you know, we mostly bring market intel from the destinations. So PBSA markets all the way from Iberia to Poland. We cover them very regularly. This time, we decided to take a different look and look at the source markets and some of the insights and trends and developments and how they can inform your recruitment strategies if you are an operator or a brand that is looking to expand the number of Chinese students, make yourself more known in the market, or if you are a developer or investor and looking to develop the right product to the international students, and Chinese students being such a prevailing nationality, it's probably important to consider what they have in mind and how they behave. So I will cover the macro, the data, and some of the initial insights focusing on the student behavior. And then Julia will take over and she will dive into things like financials, product preferences, services preferences, amenities, booking channels. And towards the end, we will wrap with a Q&A and some of the takeaways that seem to stand out when it comes to the market. So by way of very quick introduction, those of you not familiar with us, Bonard is a market research and investment intelligence firm. Our core business lies in providing quality, in-depth, and independent market data and advisory in rented residential real estate, primarily focusing on student housing, but not exclusively. We are a team of 90 researchers and analysts based in Vienna, Austria, and we have offices in Slovakia and in China. And it's particularly our China team that is responsible for this session and the content that we are bringing today. Our global PBSA coverage comprises roughly 260 markets and submarkets, over 14,000 PBSA assets with 2.3 million beds under management. To kick off with the market trends when it comes to China, we will cover demand, student mobility, top destinations, and visa. just to set the context for the ensuing findings. So starting with demand, as you can see at the following charts, on the left-hand side, we see the number of Chinese Gaokao takers, the Gaokao being the equivalent of higher education exam for students completing their secondary studies and going into university in China. Those who want to go into university in China, they must take Gaokao. Those who decide to go overseas, great news, they don't have to, but they still have to meet the requirements of overseas universities. In order to succeed in Gaokao and to enter a very top college, one must place somewhere in one top 1 percentile of students taking Gaokao. So it's incredibly competitive, and therefore so many Chinese students are opting to go overseas. As you can see, the number of Gaokao takers is increasing over the years, which is good because it stimulates the demand for study abroad. And that is evident on the right-hand side. We have 7 years of pre-COVID market student mobility development outbound from China. And we see that the number of Chinese students overseas have grown roughly 7%, even though the growth rate has gradually slowed down because the market has matured. So both these trends are very indicative of the fact that Chinese students are very interested in higher education. They're increasingly taking Gaokao. They increasingly go study abroad. And as they go study abroad, they need a place to stay. Following the 2019, Chinese Ministry of Education stopped collecting the data on the student mobility numbers. So here is our own sort of synthesis of the data that we collected from the respective governmental agencies on the number of Chinese students in the top major destinations. USA, as you can see, still on top in terms of absolute numbers, however, declining for China. One could tell it's because of the sort of sentiment between the countries, but also Chinese students are increasingly choosing other cost affordable destination. The US dollar has appreciated against yuan. It makes it more expensive to study in the US. However, the number of graduates from China is increasing. The number of undergraduates from China to US is decreasing. When it comes to UK, slightly different trend, rather positive. UK has been growing relatively well, probably best among all the top destinations, thanks to well-managed sort of COVID circumstances and regulations. UK was able to capture a lot of student mobility from the US, from Canada, from Australia, and it has benefited ever since. I would argue that UK is probably the #1 destinations in terms of appeal and popularity at the moment, because its ties with China are rather okay. So no hardline stands on particular political topics. The education is cost affordable. The duration of education is shorter, at least by 1 year. And there is other synergies that UK is benefiting from, such as transnational education. So UK universities are well experienced recruiting in China. They establish campuses in China, university partnerships. And following Brexit, they have pivoted with strong focus on Asia and China in particular. Now, when it comes to Australia, Australia was very strong, especially pre-COVID, during COVID, very strong, very stringent measures, and it has been losing number of Chinese students since. It has recovered to a certain degree. However, the recent soft student caps introduced by the government, because of lack of student housing, are presenting an ongoing issue. Basically, the government said to universities, if you want more Chinese students or any other international students, you have to build more student housing. So it's probably an opportune moment for all the PBSA sectors, stakeholders, to look at Australia. Canada, similar downward trend. It's losing number of Chinese students over the recent years. Again, COVID regulations, political sort of difficulties, and most recently the introduced hard student caps for the next 2 years, which are limiting the number of study permits issued to all the international students to roughly 250,000 per year. So essentially, Canada is seeking zero growth of international students, similarly because of lack of quality and dedicated student housing. Other markets, Hong Kong, Germany, France, they represent alternative choices, some in Asia, some in Europe. They are becoming more interesting to Chinese students, certainly from the affordability cost of view, the fact that students don't need to pay tuition in some German and French universities, or because it's cheaper to study in destinations in Asia, such as Hong Kong, Malaysia, Singapore. It makes it for alternative choices. So the mobility is shifting around these regions and trickling away from the major destinations. Here's a quick perspective on the issuance of study permits only for Chinese students. What you will find here is more or less different perspective, but signifying the same trends on the previous slide. So recovery in major destinations, however, with looming declines in Australia and Canada because of the regulations. UK still very much on top in absolute numbers, but may also see decline because of regulations towards international students there. They may affect the destination appeal. And US is over long term on a decline. It is facing a demographic cliff also in terms of domestic students. So Chinese students will be very much focus for US educators. However, there are signs of growth, at least for 2024 Q1, in terms of graduate students. So there are signs of recovery. And US, by the sheer capacity of the sector, may benefit because of the regulations in Australia, Canada, and potentially siphon some student mobility also from UK. New Zealand, just very briefly, it's a nice U-shaped recovery, but the sector is obviously limited in terms of capacity, in terms of student housing, but also education. So these are some of the developments in on the macro level. Very last slide, this is the rate of student visa grants. So you can see this is again purely for China. For Australia, it was very stable, almost 100% approval rate. So it just in recent years, it started to decline, but still good. Canada, quite a roller coaster, as you can tell. It's going up and down over the recent 4 years. So in a situation like this, certain educators from Canada may turn to other markets because they will be concerned to risk their trusted status with the immigration authorities if they face visa rejections. So Canadian educators are looking to other markets. New Zealand trending up recently, which is good news for Chinese students. And UK was very steady, almost at 100%, but has started to decline, probably because of the recent regulations as well. So that just gives you an idea that the market is fundamentally strong. Despite slow recovery, still Chinese students want to go abroad. Still, the top destinations are the English-speaking destinations, but there is just more diversity now. And the visa approval rates and the application periods are much more important factor. Moving into the actual survey, I will start with some preferences and behaviors, but first, for the research savvy of you, quickly the methodology. So we selected 500 students as a considerable and representative geographical sample. On the right, you can see the distribution between major tier 1 and tier 2 cities. So roughly equal split between North, Central, Southern, and Western China, where the major economic drivers of growth are in terms of cities. They boast very high population, as a result, student population. There is high appetite for study abroad because of the purchasing power and the level of income. And there is also robust Asian markets. So not just demand, but supply is also concentrating in these cities. When it comes to the profile of the respondent, we chose, out of these 500 students, we chose 50%, so 250 are those that have overseas study experience. So they studied overseas between years 2018 and 2023, and they can speak from a certain experiential point of view. They already have some experience with the product or destination. The other half of the students are those that are just planning to study overseas. So they may be undergraduates, or they may be in their final year of high school and looking to go to study abroad. So they have an idea, but they don't necessarily have experience. And we wanted to correlate these groups because essentially you will be catering to both. You will be targeting undergraduates and students who decide not to take ALCA and go abroad, but you will be also targeting graduates or postgraduates who are also looking to study overseas. As you can see on the left-hand chart, when it comes to the education breakdown, the majority are graduates. It's the trend. Chinese students are increasingly shifting into the graduates level when it comes to going overseas, because for the undergraduate sector, they can either study in China or maybe somewhere in the region, and they want to upgrade their qualification for that graduate degree. Also, the proportion of postgraduates is increasing, especially for those who are planning to go overseas, and that is symptomatic of the domestic job market. So if you follow the news in China, you will know that the job market, especially for those that have completed the university in the recent years, is very difficult, almost at 20% unemployment rate, according to unofficial figures, because the government is no longer providing official figures. And that creates a challenge. So what do the students do? They decide to extend their education, continuing to study. If they do, they are not counted as unemployed in the domestic job market. So it's a win-win. And so that gives you an idea of the respondent profile. And we asked them roughly 15 questions. They were anonymized. They were carried out online. It would be difficult to meet every student in person in all these geographies. So we have our effective channels, how to deploy such service remotely. And we are about to share some of the most notable findings. So when it comes to the preference of the study destination, we asked both with experience and those intending to go overseas, what's their primary choice? And you can tell by the results that, again, the top 4 destinations remain in unchanged order: US, UK, Canada, Australia. There are a couple of outliers. So Hong Kong, Germany, France, Malaysia, they are either trending up or down compared between these groups. But one overarching trend that you can take from this is Chinese students decide very early where they want to go. They decide either by the ranking of the institution, by positive recommendation from a friend, from a classmate, from a teacher, and they tend to be consistent with their choices. So they are unlikely to change the destination. And that's one factor, mostly for educators to keep in mind, but also for housing providers. We also asked about reasons for choosing PBSA. So on the left-hand side, you can see all the factors and their ranking. And the right-hand side features the top factors based on these 2 different student groups. So we wanted to see correlation and changes. I would say that for Chinese students, the number 1 primarily concern is location, location, location. So being close to university, being close to downtown, having convenience of transport, this is highly important for them when they are choosing a certain PBSA asset in a given city where they want to study. Combined with a high level of safety, with the quality of accommodation, these are probably things that you want to communicate strongly in your value proposition to the Chinese students. We highlighted the affordable rent, which you can see at the almost very last spot. Surprising. However, it seems that Chinese students, when they are deciding for PBSA, are initially not price sensitive. They become price sensitive later when they choose certain type of PBSA, and then they are deciding between various offers. Also, when it comes to those correlations on the right side, again, it's useful to keep in mind that you want to introduce these factors and communicate them, because students without experience, they have certain ideas, like they will expect engaging community. On the other hand, when they arrive, once they get experience, once they settle in, the community does no longer become such an important factor to them. It's rather the excellent facilities or the property management, or again, safety that stands out. So you want to be able to communicate these points from both experienced point of view and those who are not yet experienced, because they have preferences, but you should be able to tell them, okay, this is what you want, but you will also want this and this. So let me tell you about these factors too. When it comes to search and booking patterns, this is basically a timeline all the way from the moment they start to search for information to the arrival into the particular destination. So it may span even 2 years. And these are various milestones. What we see as a major trend here is that the new students who are just to go abroad, they are taking longer to decide, and they are deciding later. Before, so the cohort of students that we serve it with experience, they said that majority are deciding and committing to book student accommodations once they receive the offer from the university. No longer the case with the new students. They are waiting to apply for visa, and they are actually waiting to receive the visa. As you could see on the macro data, it's probably evident of the shifts in destinations. It's probably evident of the visa rates going down for Chinese students. It's probably also evident of bigger supply of student residencies. So there is more stock to choose from. There is more rooms that are available later. And there is abundance of information. And that keeps students busy. So they study more, they compare more different products. And that shifts their decision-making towards later. So you will face more competition in catching attention and sort of maintaining attention and that commitment of students throughout this longer process, all the way until they have visa. When it comes to the lease commencements, so when do they onboard, when do they arrive? Both groups didn't show particular differences. We would say that they are consistent with other international students as well. So most of the students tend to arrive roughly 1 week before the commencement of their studies. Similar pattern was identified when it comes to the contract duration. So when we asked the preference of the contract length, most students in both groups indicated that they prefer 9 to 12 months, which coincides with the academic year, because most of the Chinese students are higher education students, so they will stay long. On the other hand, those with experience, they will tend to book shorter duration eventually. Maybe they want flexibility, maybe they want to experience different assets, or maybe they are on short-term language programs. So various factors. But overall, again, this is rather consistent with the international standards of other nationalities that we witness in the PBSA. When it comes to the contract renewals, this was a particularly interesting finding. Again, 30% of Chinese students tend to renew their contracts, which is more or less, again, in line with other nationalities or other international students, and it's decent to have 30% renewal rate. However, when it comes to those who don't renew, what we found interesting is that the number one reason for not renewing is the living experience did not meet expectations. Every second student who doesn't renew, this is the reason why. When you think about Chinese students, they are very remote geographically. They speak different language. It's different culture, different norms, different expectations. The gap is wide between what they expect, what you communicate, and what they will eventually experience and benchmark towards their expectations. So in order to bridge this enormous gap, it's really important to create very clear communication, have photos, abundant photos, videos, virtual tours, contracts, brochures, testimonials, word of mouth, anything that can help you translate the accurate value and quality and services of your PBSA product to the students will help you to bridge this gap. Therefore, you will retain more Chinese students. Another interesting factor is the availability of rooms. 18% have indicated that they will not renew because there is no more room available. We asked our colleagues in China why this may be. They said that it's probably because Chinese students don't tend to study the contracts very thoroughly, and they don't look at the fine print. And again, this may be a good recommendation to brief them thoroughly upon the arrival or notify them as their contracts and the renewal periods are about to expire, so they don't find themselves in that precarious situation. That would be the initial sort of intro into the findings. And perhaps at this point, I would give it over to Julia, who will guide you through the financials, information channels, booking preferences, and the other interesting findings that we had. So Julia, I'm going to stop sharing my screen and I'll give it over to you.
Thank you, Igor.
Go. Perfect.
Amazing. See, we are on Zoom for what, 3-4 years now, and I still didn't figure it out. But good we're here. We've got to this point. I think from now on, it will be only better. I see people still didn't drop out, so that's good. Hello, everyone, again from me. Good to see some familiar faces in the audience from my student housing residential background, even though it's, again, like Igor mentioned, a new thing for us, a combination of looking at the source market and our experience with the student housing product. So, ladies and gentlemen, hello. I will tell you more about 2 sections. We actually split it to 2 more topics. We will see on the budgets of students, what they have in terms of information channels available to do the search and the booking, and then what is their preference in terms of facilities and services as a second section. So, see, the technology today is just not working for me. We were right here. Okay, so I first wanted to show you the preference of other types of accommodation aside of private student housing. We see that the offer on the private student market is growing. We observe that the market is expanding, even though slowly. But there is still an option to choose from other alternatives for Chinese students. So we wanted to see, okay, what are those and how strongly they are considering them. So you see on campus, public residence is still the biggest alternative for students. Of course, it's cheaper, safer, and also more like a traditional university housing they have in China. There are still alternatives available as hostels. It's a cost-effective option designed for young people where they meet each other. So it's preferred for a third of respondents. And then we've looked at the results geographically as well. Igor shared with you that it was a global survey, so we looked at the tier 1 and tier 2 cities. So when analyzing the results, for example, for Beijing, there were diverse preferences. So students looked at more options at the same time, and hostel was actually most popular in central and southern China. Now the budgets. So what is that the Chinese students have to spend on student accommodation in the country and by different regions? You see in dark blue the range from over 750 to 1,650 is the band that most of the students selected as their budget. We now looking at all of the students, so those who had to study abroad before and just plan to go. The budgets as well as rents in the PBSA sector were growing quite considerably in the last several years due to inflation. Students in Beijing, Shanghai, Zhenhong have the higher median budget compared to those in Wuhan, Shenzhen, Chengdu, and Xi'an. The MOT budget, so the widest one in Zhengzhou, is the highest among all cities, including a concentration of students willing to spend more on housing. In Shenzhen, students have a very concentrated range of budget choices. The majority are falling below 1,650. So there's a higher band that we've seen. Conversely, the budget distribution for the students in Beijing is more dispersed. We see different types of students that have a tighter or wider budgets, with nearly 1/3 of students are willing to accept the budgets of above 2,000. Now, what is there for Chinese students in terms of information channels before they proceed to booking? When students would look for the information on room types, prices, bookings, we see that they use a variety of channels. You see the preference is quite widely distributed. So from 76% of respondents to 58% using various channels. Student housing operator official website is actually becoming #1. Word of mouth is, of course, very strong, especially for the Chinese culture. So what they receive from a past student as a reference is valid. The difference between the channels are really minor. As I mentioned, actually, on average, the Chinese student would use 2.7 channels when gathering the information before the booking. When we look geographically again, in different regions to see some local trends, students in Shanghai have the highest reliance on international study agency consultants, while in general, Chinese students would look for information on these different platforms. They would follow up and book via an aggregator or an agent as the most prominent booking channels. We see that direct booking is also up and coming. It was interesting for me to see that the aggregators were bumped up by agents a bit, but it's understandable because the agents often work with the aggregators, so they kind of interchangeably in those spots. When we talk about aggregators, we've highlighted several for you. Those that respondents mentioned most often among the ones they use. You, of course, see the global names that are also popular in Europe, like student.com, and the local aggregators as well. We highlighted several more booking information and support channels that are needed for Chinese when they do a decision on where to live. Again, dispersity and kind of preference of the channel is stretched across several factors, signaling to us that it's important for an operator to be proficient in each of those. It's not enough to just have a website in Chinese, but a secure payment method and a 3D viewing process is required. Actually, a convenient viewing process, live webcam or a 3D view of the building came up as the first one. So 16% of respondents selected that as the most important information channel before booking. Very important, very understandable again, when renting a house in China, and this is the way the Chinese used to select their accommodation. So they consider that factor strongly as well. We, Igor touched base a bit on the local support for your Chinese tenant in their residence. We'll see that a bit later on in the sections as well, but it comes up in here as well. So Chinese website as relevant to the tenant as you can be is the key. We looked at, again, the results across cities and regions in China. So students in Wuhan expressed a strong preference for a Chinese consultant available on site or via WeChat or phone. And then when we look at students from Shanghai, they value the official Chinese website stronger than students in other regions in China. I promised you another section of the presentation, so here we are. We'll go into product preference, room type, what Chinese would prefer the most, and their expectation in terms of services and facilities. So let's dig in. Here is the preference for the room type. We again asked those who had the experience to study abroad, and then those who would plan to. Standalone bedroom is still the most preferred one. Again, maybe no surprise for some of the attendees and me as well. However, comparing the two groups, sharing a bedroom becomes an option. It's something that more students are considering, especially those who plan to study. The same as maybe sharing a bathroom or a kitchen. We also had the option actually to select shared bathroom in a hallway, for several students, not just those 2, 3, or 4, but actually no one selected that. So sharing a bathroom with more than 4 students is definitely not an option for Chinese, but sharing with 2, 3 people becoming to get interest of Chinese students, again, due to the inflation, increased costs, something that they would consider now. When we asked about the preferred services on premise, so you see in here in green this most common choices, what the students would like to see the most. You will kind of get on the trend that it's maintenance, support, any assistance they can get and promptly, security, and that local representative. We analyzed also how the preference would change from the student who did have an experience abroad, so those who studied till 2024, and those who would plan to go in the next 2 or 3 years. The overlap is quite significant, so the expectations of students would be similar to what they would ask for when they have experience already. We see that maybe visa assistance for students with the experience would rank a bit higher because they may encounter some issues and now retrospectively would require that more. In terms of kind of prompt maintenance, that key number, understandably, this is the feature the Chinese would go for into a private PBSA 4. We also know that from our local experience from our colleagues in China that shared that to have your any kind of maintenance issues fixed quickly is something that students voice when selecting accommodation. They would go for a private PBSA there instead of renting a room in a hotel or a hostel, because they understand that there is 24/7 support on site. So facilities, right? Common areas, services that the students can get. You see top 3 over there in red. So it's canteen, laundry, and security again. Chinese students used to university canteens in their homes and studies. They would prefer the cooked meal, and they would like to receive that similar service in the residence when they study abroad. We see safety coming up again. We saw that in services, right? So again, it's a key feature to provide. Monitored residence is a must. And then when we look at maybe a split of Chinese by type, again, those who studied abroad and plan to go. The overlap is still visible there. Maybe ensuite kitchen and bathroom is ranking higher for those that plan to study. You see that number 3 for the blue colored student graph. Then what to improve? We wanted to know what is that Chinese students still are missing in the residence and they would like to change. No surprise here, right? You see number 1, increased security. Security is a preference, and then if it's not to the standard they're expecting, it's the first one they name to improve. It's not only about security into the residence, into the building, but it's also no unnoticed inspections, no maintenance checked when they were not announced, or a third-party entry without a need. We again know this from our local colleagues that students are sensitive to their privacy in the room as well. So it's not only monitored access to the building. We see more Chinese-friendly service, and then Chinese social media websites. So I couldn't preach this more local presence and relevant information. We see a red book replacing Baidu for certain instances. So reviews and social media rankings are what the students are watching closely as well. We are reaching to the end here. I've outlined several key findings for the whole session for you. It's something that Igor mentioned, and then my section as well. So market fundamentals for China as a source market are going strong, despite the slow post-COVID recovery. Private student housing product is increasingly gaining popularity among Chinese students. They are aware and using it quite heavily. Again, as you've heard from Igor, in terms of decision-making, there is shifts how students decide now, later, longer. With more available information, channels to review, it's quite understandable. Then information and booking channels are abundant. So it's a variety of those to use, be proficient in all of them, and target them to your tenant type. Incorporating B2B agents, aggregators, and B2C direct channels, social media is crucial. And then your local in-country presence, local support in terms of official local representatives gives you an edge in terms of other competition. Our market understanding is not only based on the survey that we presented to you today, but it's also our office in China. Great to see the colleagues on the call as well. Hi. They would be happy to support you with various kinds of services. If you would be interested, feel free to schedule a consultation with us. And we'll be happy to provide you with the market research, something we do in Europe as well, our B2B partner introductions, or in-country representations. Some of you may have seen our interactive platform, a tool we combined to map our PBSA stock in Europe, in Australia, Canada, and a bit of Asia as well. So we cover over 260 markets interactively, where you can see how many student housing assets there are, where they're located, and how many students are coming to those city markets. I think that's it. Happy to share a few faces of our team here, and we will move on to answering some questions. Igor, what do you think?
Absolutely. Julia, thank you for all the insights that you were able to share and interpret with us. I'm definitely taking away that Chinese students require quality maintenance services in the properties. So these are interesting nuances that add towards a better understanding and maybe future planning of the operations and catering to Chinese students. There is a couple of questions. So definitely there is a time. I think we are at roughly 50-minute mark. So happy to take some questions or follow up individually later on. From those that I see, what are China-friendly services? First question that stands out. Well, it's a complex thing, definitely different to every unique operator. But one thing to keep in mind is what are the touch points of Chinese students as they interact with your brand from the very beginning all the way until they arrive and maybe until they leave. It may be information in Chinese, I would say essential to have in China, your social media platforms, your Chinese website translated, maybe a customer support who is able to address questions in Chinese. We know that Chinese students ask many, many questions. Again, remember this big gap in terms of expectations and unknowns. So these are some of the things. Greeting Chinese students in Chinese can be a small thing, but go a long way when they arrive first time on the premise. Having a local senior Chinese student as a potential ambassador who can show them around and give them tips for life and how to settle in, that can go a very long way to make Chinese students accustomed and comfortable. So it's various touch points, but sort of consider it as if you would like to treat yourself well. What can you do for those Chinese students in a similar fashion? They are very sensitive to these things. They are very sensitive to feeling welcomed, to feeling respected. Obviously, current geopolitical circumstances are not helping that, so it may be a standout pattern. Okay, other question, how were the aggregators surveyed and whether they were surveyed only on students who studied overseas or were just to go? I would say both. We wanted to know preferences towards certain aggregators in terms of their visibility, appeal. That's essentially for the students intending to go abroad. We also wanted to know experience and feedback. So students who have been overseas, they are mostly commenting from the experiential point of view, probably having used one of the aggregators on the list and giving their preference. So it's a combination of both, which makes for a bit more objective and complex comparison. That's to answer that. And another question, if there were specific breakdowns for student budgets for individual countries, obviously the budgets differ from country to country. It's a good question. I think we also identified it as something that we want to ask again when we do version 2 of the survey, maybe in 6 months, maybe in a year. So we will definitely put it on the list because I think with this, we will want to measure the changes with respect of the time and see some shifts in the patterns that we were able to identify with this first issue. Another question, how do students discover PBSA or aggregators, any specific breakdown of channels? From what I know personally, from our colleagues and having spoken to agents and aggregators in China, search engines, very big thing to focus on and invest in China. If you have a booking site as a brand, as an operator, you definitely want to have your website optimized for Chinese search engines, which is essentially Baidu. They have the most market share, but there is also other. So you have to work with somebody who's knowledgeable about search engines in China, could be a digital marketing agency or another consultant, somebody in China or maybe overseas, but definitely have your website optimized for search results from Baidu search engine. Chinese students most of them cannot search in Western platforms such as Google or any other search engines based on Western platforms. So essentially, they do all their search within the country, which is limited by the Great Firewall, and therefore you have to optimize all your websites, your social media. Your Western media may be inaccessible to many Chinese students because of the firewall. So again, you will want to invest into having local social media developed under your brand name with your content, because they will be the second most important touch point for Chinese students to go to and read and interact and probably book. Okay, I think for the time being, this would be it. Maybe a few more questions to follow up on individually. They're very specific, but yeah, please feel free to drop us any comments. First and foremost, we hope that you enjoyed. Like we said, this was a first time survey for us of this kind. There were 120 people at a certain point in attendance, so excellent turnout rate. I'm encouraged that we should do more of these, maybe also cover other key markets or repeat and have that time perspective of changes after certain times. So again, thank you very much for your time, for attending, for posting the questions, for following us, most importantly, and don't hesitate to come for us if you're looking for support in China or other markets. But in China, we have a certain special infrastructure with our local team and office. We can assist you with market strategy, with partnership development, even with having a representative in country. So those are some of the things that we can help you to succeed in this very complicated, very remote, but also very rewarding market. Thank you to my colleagues, Julia, for delivering a big part of the presentation. Always great to hear from you. And our Chinese colleagues for preparing this interesting survey.
Thanks, everyone.
Thank you. Have a
Bye.
great day. Bye-bye.